Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our virtual College of Liberal Arts Faculty Colloquium. My name is Erska Dobersek and I will be a moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I would like to provide a few remarks. We are recording this session and broadcasting live on Facebook. If you have any questions for the speaker, please state them in the chat box and we will address those during the Q&A session after the presentation. And you will also be able to raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask questions. If we have any students in the audience who wish to receive a partial or extra credit for attending today's presentation, please send me a message via chat stating your name, professor's name, and the course for which you would like to receive this credit. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. David O'Neill. Dr. O'Neill is an assistant professor of English at the University of Southern Indiana, where he teaches classes in linguistics, English language history, writing pedagogy, composition, and Latin. His research covers the full range of the history of the English language, but his current project focuses on how grammatical change in the Middle Ages influenced English language poetry. His scholarship has been published in Essays in Medieval Studies, Studia Anglica Posaunenian, a Narratio, the Medieval Journal, and World Englishes. And I apologize for mispronunciations. Dr. David O'Neill, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Erska, for that introduction. So the purpose of my talk today is to give you an introduction to the Old English alliterative verse. So this is the style of poetry that was written by the people who are commonly known as the Anglo-Saxons. So this stretches from the 5th century CE up to the 11th century. So the beginning of the Old English period was when the people who Bede describes as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes migrated to Great Britain. And it ends with the Norman invasion in the 11th century. So the Battle of Hastings in 1066 is the common date given for the end of the Old English period. So in this talk, I hope to give you a sense of how the poetry of the Old English period worked, and also a sense for why it's mysterious, why there's still controversy around the style of poetry. So my agenda for today, I'm going to start and talk about poetic meter. So there are probably many in the audience who are already familiar with what poetic meter is, but I wanted to be sure that I introduced the concept for those who maybe aren't from a background in English. After that, I'm going to talk about the medieval English alliterative verse. I'll explain a little bit about what we know about how it works, and then I'll give you some information about a couple of the competing schools of thought. So the Stresser school and the Timer school. In the next part, I want to talk about some of the research that I've done in the evolution of medieval poetry. So this is looking at how the poetry changed over time and looking at my argument, which is that grammatical change in the Old English period is an important explanation for why English language poetry changed in the Middle Ages. And then finally, I'll touch on some directions for future research. So what is poetic meter? So first, I'm going to draw your attention to the New Yorker cartoon on the right. So we have Richard the Pragmatist here, who says, "My kingdom for a newer, stabler, more centrally located kingdom." Now I'm going to commit the cardinal sin of explaining the joke here, but I think there are a couple of reasons why this is funny. So this comes from Richard III. As I imagine many of you know, the line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." So part of what might make this funny is just the more prosaic interest of this king in a stabler, more centrally located kingdom, rather than the survival situation. But the rhythm of the language also contributes. So the original Shakespearean line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, is perfectly standard iambic pentameter. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Whereas the line in the New Yorker cartoon has no discernible poetic meter. So one of the things that poetic meter does is it provides that rhythm, that structure that makes a text stand out as poetry. And this is especially true in traditional forms of poetry. Of course, now poetry is written without meter, very commonly in what we call free verse, but traditional poetries tend to have poetic meter to give it that rhythm. Usually poetic meter refers to sound qualities. So in iambic pentameter, it's the alternating patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. It could also include things like rhyme and alliteration, the length of syllables, intonation, pitch, as in Japanese poetry, for example, works on pitch. When I think of poetic meter, I conceptualize it as the aspect of poetry that distinguishes it from prose. And, you know, poetry can be defined in a lot of different ways. It's a very big term. But if we want to look at it in just the most straightforward way, poetry has poetic meter, at least, again, in traditional poetry. And sometimes I'll use the word metrical grammar, and others have done so as well, to refer to the whole cluster of effects that makes a text stand out as different from prose, poetry versus prose. So let's look at some examples of poetic meter. So this is from a children's book, Room on the Broom. I have a couple of small daughters, one who's 5 and another who's turning 2 next Thursday. So I get to encounter quite a bit of children's literature as well as Disney movies. And poetic meter is all over these texts. It's very pleasurable, sing-songy, children enjoy. And one of the most common places that people commonly run into poetic meter is going to be in songs or in children's lit. So let's look at this text. So this is just a part of Room from the Broom. So try to hear the sound and the rhythm as I read. The witch had a cat and a very tall hat, and long ginger hair which she wore in a plait. How the cat purred and how the witch grinned, as they sat on their broomstick and flew through the wind. But how the witch wailed and how the cat spat, when the wind blew so wildly it blew off the hat. So I think the rhythm jumps out at you immediately, right? And you might not know why. You hear the rhyme, of course. There's alliteration in there. But at the heart of it, there's a sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables that gives the rhythm to this poem. And if we were to analyze it, we would probably call this some Anapestic Tetrameter, which is a technical term for a certain sequence of syllables that's repeated through the poem. If we look back at ancient poetries, we see something very similar, and that is a consistent set of syllable patterns that are repeated over and over and over again in the text, with some variation, but a tendency to fall back to this same template. So why is poetic meter so common in these traditional verse traditions? Sorry about the repetition there. So I have 3 reasons on the slide. One, it aids memorization and composition for oral performance. So in the ancient world, poets were not writers. You know, poets composed and they performed out loud. And if you've ever had to memorize a text, you've probably noticed that if there are things like rhyme and rhythm in the words, it's a lot easier to remember them. So that helps with performance and also with composition. In a lot of ancient poetries, poets would compose on the fly, very much like freestyle rap compositions. So having that rhythm, that poetic meter, it was very helpful in composition. It also helped distinguish poetic expression from everyday utterances. In ancient literature, poetry and prose are totally separate worlds. And it's not so much the content as it is the rhythm of the text. So you might have a poem that's about, scientific discoveries, or, prose that's about love. What distinguishes the two is not the content, it's how it sounds. And a third reason why meter has been common in traditional verse is because of the music. There's a delight that we all get, I think, when we hear metered language. It's just we delight in rhythm. We like music, and when our language is put in these musical framings, we just enjoy it more. So let's look at an example here of the kind of meter that's used in epic verse in Greek and Latin. So this is called the Dactylic Hexameter. So the hexameter part here refers to the fact that there are 6 feet in a poetic line. Dactylic refers to the fact that each of those feet is composed of a long and two shorts. And the word dactyl in Greek refers to finger. So if you think of your finger bones, you have, I should do it this direction, you have a long one and two short ones. All right, so that's kind of like a dactyl. So the way a line of dactylic hexameter worked is in every foot you would have a heavy syllable, heavy or long, followed by two shorts. So that's the dactyl. But the two shorts could be substituted by one long. And the same thing is going to work for the next several feet. You'll have a long syllable followed by two short ones. And then when you get to the fifth, it's always a regular dactyl with long and two shorts. And then the last foot is a long and either one short or one long. And the point I want to emphasize about this is that this pattern is extremely regular. There's enough variation in those substitutions that rhythmically it remains quite interesting, even after hundreds and hundreds of lines. But if you were just to pick at random one line out of thousands and thousands of lines of Greek or Latin epic, you would find that you could probably scan just about any one you picked using this very template. So that's similar to what we saw with the children's book example, where it's very regular. And I'm emphasizing this because when we come to the medieval alliterative verse, we'll see that some of these expectations about how poetic meter is supposed to work start to fall apart, and that's part of why the meter is so mysterious. So let's look at the Dectelic Hexameter in context. So this is the beginning of Virgil's Aeneid. I have the first 7 lines, and each of the syllables has been marked either with a long or a short. And the vertical lines represent the divisions between the metrical feet. So each of these lines has 6 metrical feet, and each of them can be analyzed as either a dactyl, which is the long and two shorts, or a spondy, which is the two longs. This is the substitution of the long for the two shorts. So I'm going to read this aloud, and as I read, I think you will hear the rhythm and have a sense of how that poetry is supposed to sound. Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus aboris, Italiam fato profugus Lavinia que venit, litora multi letteris jactatus et alto, vi superum saevae memorem non sabiram, multa coquet bello passus dum conderet urbem, inferret quedeus latio, genus unde latinum, Albani que patres atque altae moenia Romae. So as I read that, I intentionally was emphasizing the rhythm. You could read it in a more natural way, so it wasn't quite as sing-songy. But that rhythm is going to come out, and that rhythm is what really makes for ancient epic. You have ancient epic when you read a series of lines that has this rhythm to them. I was thinking about reading an example from Homer's Iliad, which has the same meter, Dactylic Hexameter. Maybe I'll just read the first line so you can hear that it is similar. And so this first line is, rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles. And you could continue on with that rhythm. Okay, so moving on to the medieval alliterative verse. So the point that I've been trying to make is that most traditional metered poetry, at least the ones that I have been familiar with, they follow a very regular pattern. And even the ones that I've encountered outside of languages that I'm familiar with, such as Sanskrit poetry. I don't read Sanskrit, but I know that Sanskrit also follows similar rules where there are regular sequences of syllables that once you understand, you can easily predict what's going to happen in each line. But this isn't really the case in medieval English poetry, in the Old English period. Something seems to be not quite understood, even now, after over 100 years of pretty serious attention from English scholars. So let's talk about what we do know first, and then we'll get into some of the division in the field. So the first thing we know is that this style of poetry, the alliterative verse, is common to Germanic languages. So if we look over here at the right in this language tree, we see the Germanic language family. Up above Germanic, we have Proto-Indo-European, which is the ancestor language to all of the Indo-European languages spoken from the British Isles to India. So in Germanic, we see over here English in the West Germanic language family. So Old English obviously had alliterative poetry. Another Germanic language that had alliterative poetry was Old Saxon, and another is Old Norse. So Old Norse is the northern Germanic language family. So Old Norse would be the mother, so to speak, of the Scandinavian languages. Or we might think of Old Norse as Viking languages. So Vikings used a similar style of poetry. So we know something about the provenance of the alliterative verse. And we know a little bit about the structure as well. So a line of Old English poetry is divided into two halves. And not necessarily in the manuscripts themselves, but at least as we analyze them, we can determine that there are two halves to a line. And there are generally two stresses per half line. So that's a regularity. Not always, but generally two in each half. And at least one stress from the first half is going to alliterate with the first half from the second half. And that's why we call it alliterative verse. So alliteration is what you're going to notice immediately if you start reading. Beyond this, though, there's controversy. And I'm going to show you some examples to help you understand why that might be. So this is the very first extant poem in the English language. It's called Cadman's Hymn from the 7th century. There's a charming story attached to Cadman's Hymn that I'm going to share with you. I just love this story, and it has a lot of useful content in it as well. So the story is that Cadman was a herdsman, so an illiterate herdsman, just a commoner, a peasant essentially, and he had no knowledge of how alliterative verse would work. And at this time, alliterative verse, it existed, but it existed for heroic Germanic stories, that might touch on the old Germanic gods. But one of the things that would happen in this period, as the story comes to us from Bede, is that people would sometimes gather in the evening and they would pass around a harp, and they would take turns strumming on the harp and composing something, doing a little freestyle of this, Old English verse. And in the story, Cadman always got a little scared when this happened, because he had just had no talent for music or for poetry. And so when he saw the harp coming around and it was about to get to his turn, he would always slip out so that no one could, see how untalented he was. He was embarrassed. Well, one night this had happened, and he went out and he fell asleep in the stables. And that night he had a dream. And in the dream, a figure came to him and started composing to him and singing in perfectly metrical Old English verse about the creation of the world. And so when Cadman woke up in the morning, he had a perfect memory of this. And so he started to share this, and he started singing this verse. And, the people were so amazed that they took him to the monastery and presented him to the abbot. And so the abbot wanted to test this. And so they would give him, stories from the Bible, and he would immediately start singing these stories in perfect Old English verse. So we learn a couple of things from this story. And one is that this poetry really was composed orally. So there was freestyle composition. The story itself, most of it's apocryphal, but I think we can trust that there probably were parties like this where, people would take turns, coming up with new stories in this style of poetry. And we also learned that the harp was used, that music would accompany the performance of this poetry. And we should keep that in mind as we look at some theories later about, what kind of verse is possible in a style of poetry where this kind of freestyle composition is going to work. All right, so let's look at the first few lines of Cadman's Hymn. So this is the very first sentence of English poetry that we currently have. Nu we scholen herian, her van Richas word, mer todas mekta on his modia thank, werk wer de vader, zwa he wondera je was, etche drikten or onstelde. And this means, now we must praise the ward of the heavenly kingdom, the might of the measurer and his mind's purpose, the work of the glory Father, as he, each of wonders, eternal Lord, established a beginning. So if we're going to begin to analyze this, you will see the alliteration, and I've highlighted the alliterating syllables. So we have H's here in the first line. In the second, we have a couple M's that alliterate with an M in the second. A couple of W's alliterating with a W here. And then in the last line, we have vowels. So any vowel could alliterate with any other vowel. So that part is pretty easy to understand. But then let's look at the syllable patterns. So just eyeballing this, and I don't expect you to do any kind of serious statistical analysis of this or anything, but it seems very chaotic. The number of S's is different per line, so we have one S in the first half line, and S's are fully stressed syllables. There are two here, one, so you go one or two. We sometimes will have a small S, which is a syllable of secondary stress, sometimes not. The X's are unstressed syllables. They're varying different numbers, so some lines have just two, some have as many as six, and they're in different positions. Sometimes we have an S at the beginning of a half line. Sometimes they're unstressed syllables. Sometimes there's an S at the end, sometimes not. So there's quite a bit of variation. And if your expectation is set by looking at, say, a poem like Room on the Broom, or the Greek and Latin styles of poetry, you would be very surprised because there doesn't seem to be a basis for rhythm, at least not in the same way as in those styles of poetry. So I'm obviously not the first person to have been a little bit perplexed when I first encountered Old English poetry. So I'm going to read you a couple of quotes that highlight this peculiarity that has been observed really since the very beginning as scholars have looked at Old English poetry. So this first quote is from J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien obviously had an incredible gift for languages. He invented his own languages. He knew many ancient and modern languages. And he had a really wonderful intuition for poetry as well. And the way he put it is he said that Old English poetry was more like masonry than music because of its lack of a single rhythmic pattern progressing from the beginning of a line to the end. So by the lack of music, I think he's referring to this lack of a standard rhythm, right? If you were trying to look for a beat, a very rhythmic beat with equal intervals, equally timed intervals, you're not going to find that. So he calls it more like masonry. So it's masonry maybe in the medieval style. If you imagine maybe irregular rocks or stones that are being put together to build a wall, and they're different sizes, but when you put them together, they form a quite solid structure. And to update the metaphor, we could think of Tetris blocks. So Tetris blocks are different shapes, but a skilled practitioner of the game Tetris can put them together into a very fine structure. Okay, let's look at another comment. So this is much more recent. And so Chris Golston is a linguist, and he's basing this statement on excuse me, a statistical analysis. So Tolkien's was based on intuition, but they've come to largely the same conclusion. So Golston says, Old English poetry follows an anti-pattern. The point of the meter is to have rhythmic variety between the two halves in every line, more Coltrane than Chopin. So for Golston, the lack of consistency is the very point. It's an anti-pattern, a kind of intentional avoidance of this sort of regular rhythm. And I like the way he describes this at the end. It's more Coltrane, it's more jazz than classical in the way that the poetry works. All right, so let's look at a couple of the older schools. So there are two schools here, the stressors and the timers, and they're both confronting this problem. So we see this style of poetry that doesn't seem to work like other poetry that we seem to understand. We can't find this regular rhythm. It's not obvious in the way that Greek and Latin poetry is obvious. So there are a couple of different approaches to this. And how can we sort this out and find an answer to this problem? So the stressors their approach is to catalog patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables, as the name would indicate. So they're going to go through the texts, and they're going to look through some of those patterns. I'm going to go back a couple of slides. So we see these patterns here. They're going to go through and they're going to catalog all these patterns. So, how often does a sequence like this show up? How often does a sequence like this show up? And put them together into a kind of system and say, okay, there's a lot of lines of this type, a lot of lines of this type, and so forth, and maybe try to find commonalities between some of them. So their approach favors classification over theorization. And what I mean by that is rather than trying to find a unifying theory that describes everything, they're more looking at the parts and seeing how they can sort them out. A possible criticism of this approach is that this classification avoids generalization. And I have a quote here from a physicist, Ernest Rutherford. And he was he's a physicist, obviously, from this quote. He was criticizing the other sciences, and his opinion was that only physics is fully generalizable. The other sciences, they're just collecting facts and putting the facts together rather than trying to put them together into a larger theory. And of course, this was looking at the science of his time. And maybe there's even some justice to this, although it's probably a little unfair. But we could apply this to the stressors. All science is either physics or stamp collecting. In a sense, what the stressors are doing is stamp collecting, looking at all the different patterns and putting them together in a book so we can enjoy them that way. The timer school emerged as a reaction to the stressors. So the timers felt that the stressors had lost the beauty of the poetry. They couldn't capture the rhythm of the language. So what the timers tried to do is find some way that we could justify a consistent performance of this poetry. If the language didn't seem consistent, if it didn't seem like there were regular intervals or a regular time signature, maybe that would come out in performance. So they're going to think about evidence like the fact that the harp was used, the singing of the verse, to try to say, well, maybe the performers of that poetry would hold certain syllables out longer. Maybe they're going to strum the harp at certain key times in order to create regularity that's not apparent. So there's definitely some appeal to this, and I think intuitively the timers are very persuasive. But there's some criticism possible of this school as well, and that is that it is highly intuitive, so it doesn't have the kind of evidence we might want, and can be based on speculative reasoning, based on the individual theorist. Okay, so let's look in detail at that first school, the stressors. So this guy over here on the left is Edward Sievers. He's sort of the forefather of the stressor school and probably the most important name in the field of Old English metrics even today. Most textbooks, if they cover Old English meter, they're going to cover Edward Sievers. So what he did is he devised 5 types. So he took all the different rhythmic subtypes in Beowulf, and by some accounts that's over 100, and he tried to narrow that down into 5. So there is a certain generalization here because there are 4 what are called 4 positions. I'm not going to go into detail about this during this talk. But I will say there's some generalization, but at the same time, these 5 types don't have a lot in common with each other besides the 4 positions. The stresses are in different places. The unstressed syllables are in different places. And it seems like, what isn't possible? I mean, this does rule out certain kind of rhythms, but it seems like more is possible than not possible based on this kind of theory. So let's look at the timers then. So as I mentioned, the timers often relied on evidence such as the harp, which is mentioned in literature and also found in archaeology. So the picture here of the harp, this is a reconstruction of the harp that was found at Sutton Hoo. So at Sutton Hoo in 1939, there was an archaeological dig, and an Anglo-Saxon burial ship was uncovered, and it was full of all sorts of treasures, including this harp. And I'm just as an aside, this is completely happenstance, but my wife and I were watching Netflix last night, and just, as it is, it's hard to find something that we can watch that's going to be, appropriate with the kids in the room and that we're going to enjoy. And we found something called The Dig that came out in just this January. I thought, oh, it's about archaeology, and we're kind of Anglophiles. So I thought, oh, let's check this thing out. And it just so happened this movie is about the archaeological dig at Sutton Hoo, which I thought just incredible coincidence that came up. So I had to mention it. Pretty good movie too, if you're looking for something to check out. Oh, and I have one more aside here as well. So I've been referring to this instrument as a harp, and that is because in Old English it's referred to as a herp, which is spelled H-E-A-R-P. So it's obviously the word for harp, and traditionally thought of as a harp. But this is actually a lyre. So the difference between a lyre and a harp is with a lyre, the strings are attached to a bridge at the top, and for a harp, the strings are attached to the instrument itself. So if we think of like the curved harp, and the strings are attached to the instrument. And I point this out just because it was drilled into my head in a very tense moment for me. So I refer to the harp in my dissertation. And the day of my dissertation defense, I showed up just a little bit early, and one of the members of my committee was there. And so I sat down, and I thought to myself, oh, we'll probably make some small talk. Maybe he'll ask me about what my plans are after this, or just talk about the weather. Who knows? But we sit down, and literally the first words out of his mouth were, "It's a lyre, So I got, even before the dissertation defense commenced, I was corrected on referring to a lyre as a harp. But let's look at one of the theorists from the timer school. So as I've said, they're highly intuitive. They're interested in finding the music that is lost in stressor methods of understanding the verse. So this is John Nist. John Nist is a very entertaining guy. I think he has says a lot of really appealing things. And I think probably you'll agree as I read this. So let's just read through this quote. So John Nist says, "Modern scholars of Beowulf seem to have very poor ears for the rhythm of the poem. They have been corrupted, as it were, by an anemic tradition of silent reading, classical foot scansion, Sievers' 5 types of verses, and emotional timidity in the presence of tremendous gut energy. Many of these same scholars call for Beowulf to have a dignity in performance that, if ever executed by the shopes of the 8th century mead halls, would have put whole bands of hard-drinking warriors into a coma." And I don't know if this is completely fair, but I think he has something. If we're trying to find a kind of poetic meter that realistically would have been used by shopes, which is the Old English word for these traveling bards or poets, that these shopes would have been able to use and entertained bands of warriors in mead halls, we're probably not going to want a super complicated set of 130 subtypes. There's probably something that's missing there. But at the same time, the timer school isn't completely satisfying either, because it relies completely on that intuitive sense. And they don't have the kind of evidence that we would want to form more secure conclusions. Now, there have been many, many, many different schools of thought on this following along, and there are some modern ones that have been catching on and some that have been discarded. I just want to point your attention to one more traditional voice. And this is one that never really caught on, but which was very influential in my own thinking when I first started studying the Old English alliterative verse. So the scholar's name is Marjorie Daunt. And it's kind of interesting that she is a woman. Old English metrics is a field that even today is dominated by men. And of course, in the early part of the 20th century, that was even more so. But I think she was on to something that these other scholars weren't. And that is that the way that Old English poetry seemed to work is not just syllable patterns. It seems to be about syntactic or grammatical patterns. So that is, there are particular phrases that seem to fit in half-line positions. So all that work that these other scholars were doing, at least in this view, is a kind of emperor has no clothes situation, where they're cataloging all these stress patterns when maybe stress patterns weren't the point of it to begin with. Maybe those stress patterns that they're discovering are accidental artifacts of some other pattern, maybe a phrasal kind of pattern that exists in the poetry. And Daunt kind of hints at this in the way that she refers to the verse. So I'll read this quote. What neither Sievers nor any other writers, to my knowledge, have ever pointed out is that the 5 types are language patterns, not metrical patterns. They are pieces of language, and within the piece, the word order is usually normal, while the poetic effect is achieved by repetition and alternation of pieces. So I think that's very perceptive, that if we look at, say, a type A, Sievers type A, that's very commonly a sequence of 2 nouns. And if we were to look at other types, we would see other consistencies as well, but that just gives you a sense of what I'm talking about. So let's look at a couple of the research questions that have guided my own work. Excuse me, I have a bit of a tickle. So the first question is, can the rhythm of a line of medieval English alliterative verse be predicted by its grammatical structure? So this refers back to what I was saying when I was reading from Marjorie Daunt. So if we do a close analysis of the grammatical structure of each unit of Old English alliterative verse, can we find a connection between the grammar of that unit and the rhythm of that unit? And the next question I looked at, this is going to be a diachronic question, in other words, looking at a change over time. What effect did grammatical change during the Middle Ages have on the evolving rhythms of English poetry? So this is the larger question that guides my research. The Middle Ages was a time of drastic grammatical change in the English language. I don't know if I have any of my history of the English language students in the audience, but if I do, they'll know this is one of the things that we cover intensely in that class. Old English grammatically was much more similar to modern German, or even a language like Greek or Latin, than it is to modern English because of its grammatical structure. And the change that occurred to make English like it is today, almost all of that occurred during the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages are a time of intense grammatical change in the English language. And it's also a time where the standard mode of poetic expression changes. So the Old English meter dies out and is replaced by meters such as what we see in Shakespeare, or even the children's book that I showed you. So I wanted to find a connection between these two things. So if grammar and rhythm are connected in Old English, well, maybe the changes in grammar can be used to explain the changes in rhythm over the Middle Ages. Okay, so the methods that I used. So I put together a digital corpus of medieval alliterative poems spread out from the 7th to the 14th century. And what I did with each of these poems, I took a sample and I looked at the lines, and I'm going to code them for syntactic features. So those are things like parts of speech or phrase groups, so the grammar of the units. And then I code them for prosodic features, and prosodic features are going to be the rhythm or poetic features, so things like stress patterns or metrical type based on Sievers analysis. And here's an example of how this works. So Beowulf 1b in Jardeum in former days. So we see that this half line is a prepositional phrase with a preposition with a noun phrase complement, and it's a compound noun, Jardeum. And in my analysis, I considered this half line syntactically cohesive because that one half line, it has one phrase, it's one prepositional phrase, and it matches up with those half line boundaries. And then we look at the prosodic pattern here. So we see each of the Greek sigmas means a syllable, and the asterisks refer to the prominence of the syllable. So 1 asterisk is an unstressed syllable, 3 is primary stress, and 2 is secondary stress. So we have the syntactic pattern next to the prosodic pattern, and this is metrically a type C in the Sievers system. Here's a more involved example of this. I'm not going to go through everything here, and don't worry if this looks complicated. There's obviously too much in a talk like this to explore. But I just wanted to show you one of the things I was looking for. So the full sentence is diagrammed using a tree diagram. So we have the sentence broken up into, these are separate clauses here. There's independent clause followed by a dependent clause. We have NPs, which are noun phrases, and BPs, which are verb phrases. And so once I had that syntactic structure with the trees, what I did is I went through and I drew boxes around the verse boundaries. So this box here is verse 4a, and this is 4b, 5a, 5b, and so forth. So what I wanted to do is see how frequently we could see a connection between the syntax boundaries and the prosody boundaries, the metrical boundaries. And for the most part, you can see that there is pretty strong alignment. So we have one phrase here, a noun phrase that is one half line, a noun phrase for a half line, a verb phrase for a half line, a verb phrase for a half line, a verb phrase for a half line. 4a and 6b do not have that cohesion, but interestingly, both of these are the first half line of a clause, and that becomes important in some of my findings. So what I want to point out here is just that it turns out to be correct, that you can predict a great deal about the rhythm of a half line by looking at its syntactic structure. So starting over here with the first two columns, we have syntactic features, whether there's a syntactic particle at the beginning of the clause, whether we have noun phrases, adjective phrases, verb phrases, and so forth, whether there are compounds. So if we follow this along, we can see that, for example, if there is no verse initial particle, we have a noun phrase, and there is no compound noun, then we know in the sample I was looking at that every single time it was a type A. If we had no verse initial particle, and we had, say, a prepositional phrase, and there was a compound, then every single time that was a type E. So for those two cases, it's predicted entirely. In some cases, there were several options. So the alignment is not 100%, but it's enough to show that syntax and prosody, in other words, grammar and rhythm, are working together. All right, so then looking at grammatical change. So this just shows what I kind of explained a little more casually before, that there was intense grammatical change in the Middle Ages. So from the beginning of the Middle Ages to the end, English transitioned from Old English to Middle English. In Old English, there were very complex noun and verb inflections. So that means, if you ever studied a language like Latin or German, you have cases like nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, where you put on endings to capture a word's syntactic function in a sentence. At the same time, there weren't many functional words, because the job of those little functional words like prepositions and auxiliary verbs, a lot of that work was done by the noun and verb inflections. And word order was also a lot more flexible. By the time of Middle English, English was becoming like modern English. We have very, very simple noun and verb inflections in modern English. There are really only 7 inflections. And they're very, very easy to learn. But the meaning that might be captured by inflections in another language, like Old English, has to be captured by having more of these functional parts of speech. So if we look over here, we see functors. In Middle English, there are a lot more prepositions, pronouns, conjunctions, and so forth, because they take up some of the work that was done by the endings, by the noun and verb endings in Old English. So looking at this, I wanted to test whether we can predict the changes that occurred in the rhythm of the poetry by looking at the changes in the grammar. So here's a little bit of the illustration here. So one of the most obvious changes in the rhythm of poetry in the alliterative tradition over the Middle Ages is that the line gets longer and longer and longer. So this here represents the first half of the line and the second half of the line. So we see in the 7th and 8th century in my corpus, there was somewhere under 5 syllables for each of these units. 4.86 in the first half line and 4.73 on average in the second. And as we go forward in time, more and more syllables are accruing to the poetic line. So by the 14th century, we see that the first half has 7.5 syllables as compared to only 4.86 at the beginning, and 6.3 in the second half. So this is the most obvious of the rhythmic changes. So let's see how we can explain that. I'm sorry, we'll look just one more example of rhythm before I look at the grammar. So these are several poems, and all I'm going to look at here is the way that syllables change. So we see gradual increase from 4.56 per half line up to 6.8 there. But notice that the changes are not in every syllable. So lexical stresses are the stresses from words like nouns and verbs and adjectives, the words with the meaning in a line. Notice that it stays pretty constant around 2. There's very little change in the number of stressed syllables per half line. But we see a very dramatic increase in unstressed syllables, going from about 2.39 up into the range of about 5 per half line. So this is creating a situation where stressed syllables are getting spaced out by this sort of sea of unstressed syllables between them, which changes the possibilities for rhythm. If you have all of these unstressed syllables, the line of poetry is just not going to sound the same. If you're used to hearing a certain pattern with very few unstressed syllables, you add a big basket of stressed syllables, it's not going to work anymore. All right, so let's look at where they come from. So I have here prepositions, conjunctions, pronouns, and determiners. So determiners are words like the definite article, the. So these are all functional parts of speech. They're grammatical words. And so notice how much more frequently they're starting to show up in these poems. So I don't have the dates here, but these are the Old English poems over here in the first half. Brut is an early Middle English poem, and then the last 3 are 14th century Middle English poems. If we were to graph this along a line chart here with a scatter plot, so we would see these are the number of functors, words like pronouns and prepositions and so forth, plotted against time. And so we see there is a definite correlation between time of composition and the number of functional parts of speech that show up in each. All right, so I'm about to draw to a conclusion here. So I conclude that grammatical changes in the history of English explain some rhythmic differences between early and late medieval verse and may have contributed to the decline of the alliterative tradition. So the part about the decline I hadn't really touched on. Maybe if we can talk about it in the Q&A. But a point I'm making there is that the kind of poetry that worked in Old English became impossible. The rhythms just didn't work anymore once there were all these unstressed syllables. So the preference for a new kind of poetic meter took over in the late Middle Ages. And another conclusion is that the effects of grammatical change were gradual rather than erratic. So if you look at the scatter plot from that last graph, supporting a model of continuous evolution in the alliterative tradition. So sometimes scholars have looked at Old English and Middle English poetry as like 2 totally separate things. But what I'm trying to show here is that it appears that there has been a continuous tradition that was gradually changing over time, rather than these 2 totally divided styles of meter. Okay, so we are getting towards the end, so I'm just going to move forward to the Q&A section.
Thank you very much, David, for sharing very interesting and wonderful presentation. We do have a few questions. I will address Q&A chat. Can you share with us a couple of your favorite medieval poems or stories?
Okay, a couple of my favorites. Well, Beowulf is obviously a favorite, I think, for most people who study Old English poetry. But I also like some of the elegiac poems. So there's a tradition in Old English poetry of elegy, and these are very kind of depressing, sad poems that kind of they ponder over the loneliness and meaninglessness of life. So poems like The Wanderer, which I really enjoy as well. There's kind of bleakness to them. And if you think of what England must have been like in the early Middle Ages, I think it kind of makes sense.
Okay, great. And then we have another question. What made you choose this area of study? Do you remember what first caught your attention about the medieval period?
Sure. So I actually started with the classics. So as an undergrad, I studied Greek and English as a double major. And then when I was going on to grad school, I was studying linguistics, and I was, getting interested in Latin as well. And I was studying Greek and Latin poetry. And when I was writing my master's thesis, I wanted a style of poetry to compare Greek and Latin to. And so I started looking at Old English meter. And what really captured my attention is just how different it was. And the fact that there was so much left to explore and so much that wasn't explained, this kind of medieval mystery. And, when you're trying to put together a dissertation, you need to find an unsolved problem. And so I thought this is catnip, for this kind of linguist looking for something, a poetic meter that really hadn't been answered yet.
Right, great. This question is referring to Cædmon's hymn that you read. Was that hymn the earliest written poem of this period?
Yeah, so Cadman's hymn is the earliest that we have a record of. So, there must have been much older poems, but this shows up in Bede, so the Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people. So he reports the story, and it's kind of funny. He actually Bede, when he referenced the story, he includes the poem in Latin because his history is written in Latin, so it's not very useful. But a scribe is actually written in the margins of the text, the English version of Cadman's hymn, to go along with Bede's Latin. So it is the oldest that we have a record of, the oldest extant English poem.
Great. Then we have a question from Michael. David, I'm sure you have read Walt Whitman's poetry, which would fall very solidly within the versification style described by Daunt. Rhythm created by repetition of syntactic units. This wasn't a question, but an observation. But he does have a question. However, does the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins shed any light on how one may read Anglo-Saxon poetry?
So I think that's a really interesting observation about Whitman, and I think it would be really interesting to look at Whitman and do a kind of stressor analysis, to see if you could analyze it in the way that Whitman did not intend. Because, if what someone like Daunt said is correct, we shouldn't have been doing that kind of analysis in the first place for the Old English poems. So could we find these sort of pseudo-metrical patterns in Whitman? I think that'd be interesting to see if the syntactic units lend themselves to these stress patterns. So I'm no expert on Gerard Manley Hopkins. I do think his poetry is wonderful, and I think his use of alliteration and his attempts to kind of capture the Old English poetry is really enjoyable. I don't know if I can give any kind of expertise on that, but I think that for reading Anglo-Saxon poetry for enjoyment, I imagine that if you read something like Gerard Manley Hopkins and go back and read Old English poetry, you'd probably maybe just catch the music of it more than you would have otherwise, not in a scholarly way, but just as a reader.
Michael has another follow-up comment and question. Fascinating. Thank you, David. Would you say that you're doing science and not stamp collecting per Rutherford? I would suppose yes.
I hope so. Yeah, I do hope that I'm making some generalizations that count as science. And I should say also that with some of these debates about how the Old English meter was supposed to work, I mean, there are so many more entries into this debate beyond just the ones that I mentioned. In my publishing, I try to remain agnostic about which school of analysis we want to follow. So I'm more interested in how we can understand change. So I think the work that I've done on how grammatical change influences the changes in rhythm, I think it applies regardless of the school. So what I've tried to do is keep my research theory independent, at least in that sense, so that no matter what school somebody comes from, they can find value in it.
Right. Lana is asking, are you able to use digital humanities tools to do analysis on a larger scale?
So the way I did this, it's not in the larger scale that we see in some corpus work, but I sometimes have joked that, in my research, I read medieval poetry by the glow of an Excel spreadsheet. So what I've done is I put all the verses in Excel, I do my analysis, and I do, run the formulas to look for statistical patterns in Excel. There aren't enough like digital corpora of Old English poems that have been coded to do like massive analysis without going through and doing it on your own. But I have been trying to expand my corpus so that I have more representative results. And in fact, I had one of our students this last summer who helped with that, John Dwyer. Through a CLABDA, he was able to analyze several poems to increase the size of the corpus.
Great. How many languages do you speak? It seems like you know multiple old languages, maybe.
Well, I love the old ones. It's easier in a sense when you study the ancient languages because you don't have to do the conversation. But I started with the classics in Greek and Latin, and then I got into Old English and Middle English because of medieval studies. Then I've had to read German and Italian for some of the research I've done. I've touched on a few others. I think it's fun just to try to get a sense of the structure. So I know about a lot of languages, even though I'm fluent, and I would say not many.
Right. And Amy's asking, have you seen the Bro translation of Beowulf? And if so, what do you think of such a liberal translation?
I haven't. I'd love to hear what Amy has to say about this. Actually, I don't know if she can come in. Maybe I'll ask you about that later, Amy. I mean, in general, I enjoy liberal adaptations. Bro, yeah, just the first word of Beowulf. That's like translating the poem is such a conundrum because what do you do with quat? And there are whole articles about how are you supposed to translate the first. Some people argue it doesn't even mean listen. It really means what or something. It's a pronoun. And I kind of favor that interpretation. I think the beginning with behold or look or listen, I think that's it's kind of off base. But I should check that out. I have not seen the Bro translation.
Amy, feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to add any other comments. Do we have any additional questions for David? I don't see. I believe we answered all the questions in Q&A chat as well as in the chat box.
Oh, did Monica O'Neill raise her hand?
Somebody raised a hand? Oh, yes. Allowed to talk.
Hey, David, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I want to go back to your discussion of Dactylic Hexameter for a second.
Okay.
And during that part of your discussion, you were talking about Dactylic Hexameter and Epic Meter as a way used often to delight, to bring delight to listeners and readers. And I think you even made a passing allusion to Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, where Lucretius states that he uses mythical language to put honey on the brim of the cup of wormwood. And I think this quote fits with your comments about meter delighting readers and listeners. But what I'm curious about is in your studies, if you can point to any examples where meter has been used didactically as well, as an aid to actually learning.
Do you have any examples in mind? Kind of jog my thinking on this.
Well, I was just wondering about even when you touched on children's literature as meter and rhyme scheme as aids in memorization of important things.
So yeah, there's like the month rhyme, and actually I don't remember it that well, so this kind of belies the point. But 30 days hath, what's the 30 days hath November? Does anybody know that one? I think a lot of times, even something like the alphabet song, it's put into a musical cadence as a way to make it easier to remember. So I think that especially in older forms of education where memorization was so much more important than it is now, having that rhythmic structure, helps students to memorize much longer pieces than students today would ever hope to do. I think people just used to have a better memory for things like that. The meter helped.
We have another question from Michael. Many early alphabet books, for instance, those published in the American colonies, relied on rhythm. Oh, there was a comment. Sorry, not a question.
Oh, I didn't see the comment.
Many early alphabet books, for instance, those published in the American colonies, relied on rhythm.
Okay, good, yeah. And I wish I could mention some more specifics offhand.
And then Laura is mentioning, that's fascinating, thank you, referencing your earlier comment when Beda translates Cædmon's hymn to Latin, thus he imposes a Latin meter. Does his translation have any clues for how he understood the original meter?
There isn't, and it would be amazing if there was something like that. And Bede would have been the person to do it because Bede was a scholar of the classical languages, and he wrote a text on Poetic Meter, but he just did not talk about Old English meter. He didn't seem to have much interest, and I think there's just an attitude that Greek and Latin were the legitimate areas of study, and English just was not. It didn't have the scholarly heft that you would want if you were doing a scholarly work. So that's one of the issues with Old English meter is that we don't have a scholar from that period or just a person who writes and explains how it works. We just have to make inferences from what we see. Whereas for something like Greek and Latin, there are so many authors that write about how it works. So it would be amazing if Bede or someone else had provided that.
Great. I believe we addressed all of the questions. Monica, you have a hand up. I don't know if you have another comment or question.
Oh, no, sorry. I think that was an accident.
Okay, gotcha. Not a problem.
Well, I do appreciate all these really thoughtful questions there. It really, I appreciate the attention and interest in the talk.
Thank you very much, David, for this wonderful talk and also great discussion, great questions. And thank you, audience, for attending this session. Our next talk will be on March the 26th by Dr. Michael Strzeski, Associate Professor of Anthropology. The title of his presentation is An Excellent House of Private Entertainment, the Harmonies Tavern in New Harmony, 1815 through 1825. With that, we are concluding our session. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.